Welcome to VITKA-Podcast. This is the first episode done in English. I have done a dozen or so in Finnish before recording this one. And I was very nervous and wobbly before and during the conversation. But I strongly believe that one should challenge himself or herself and keep on learning new things and trying out new things. I'm not very pleased with my level of English in this one, but I do feel the value of the conversation is what matters in the end. It's very frustrating when you can't find the right words, but that's what happens in the reality when you are having an unscripted discussion with someone. And at least we were able to understand each other and share our thoughts, and that's good enough for me. So bear with me and with my level of English. I would like to tell you a few words about the podcast in general before we jump into the episode. Myself, I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and I especially like the long form. I enjoy listening for conversations that take 2 hours, and that's the same thing I want to do with my podcast. And also, instead of short edited interview kind of podcast, kind of where it feels like a ready-made product, I aim for the long form, unscripted version, discussions that are breathing. I'm not completely sure where it's going to lead up to. And I want to have discussions with important and interesting people. People who somehow have unique thinking. Either the way they think or then their expertise, or even both. I might not agree with all of my guests with all of on all matters, but still I do want to have the conversations and also to share it with other people as well. In the past episodes that I have done in Finnish, I started with the topic of education and the COVID-19 effects on learning and teaching, online school, remote learning, remote work, and so on. Recently, I've had also guests on that are not connected with school. Let's see if I can do that in English as well. My first guest is Jim Reese, and there's a clear reason why I wanted him to be the first guest among many other people, both in Finland and around the world. Jim has hugely influenced my professional development and my career. And especially his influence, I can pinpoint with time and date when he changed my career. And that's what makes him special for me. But I really hope that this episode will make his wonderful ideas and experience on how to promote thinking and learning across the school. This will make it clear for all the listeners. So, without further ado, here's another new chapter in my career with Jim Reese. Welcome to VITKA-Podcast. And this is a very special episode in the history of VITKA. This is, as you are able to hear, this is the first one done in English. And I'm truly honored and pleased to have Mr. Jim Reese as the first guest in English. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Vili. It's great to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing fine. Considering it's kind of rainy and a bit cool here in Washington D.C. So it's kind of a dreary day. So it's nice to be inside and having something to keep me really nicely occupied.
Yeah. Well, it's quite the opposite here in Maldives. It's quite sunny and hot as it is almost the whole year around. So actually, the DC part gets us straight to the point why I really wanted to join in VITKA and why I sent you the invite. I think it was 3 years ago, 2017, when we met. You hosted me in your school for a couple of days. Mm-hmm. Was it 2017? Right.
I think so. Yeah, that's my recollection as well.
Yeah. So could you tell us a little bit about the school you work with?
Sure. So I work at Washington International School, and it's a school that was founded in 1966 to serve the international community in the District of Columbia and the surrounding suburbs. And from that time, when we started with just a pre-K classroom in the basement of the founder's home, we've grown to be a pre-K through grade 12 school. We were the first IB World School in North America, and we now have 900 students. We have a full immersion French and Spanish program for the first 3 years in the school, and then the kids are going through the school working toward a bilingual IB diploma. So we've been recognized for being a really strong language school, but also having a sort of a world curriculum instead of a US-centric curriculum.
Yeah, that's really. I have a vivid memory of the bilingual situation and the atmosphere in your school that you introduced me to some of the students who were studying mainly in Spanish, I believe.
Right, we do Spanish and French, right?
Yeah, and then there are students who study in English as well.
Right.
That's very, very interesting. For as you know, that I work at international school as well. Our teaching language is English, but also the Maldivian national language Divehi is present, but the instruction language is English. But we do have a very different situation in a way that we have the national language Divehi, but then the main language that we use is English. So it's kind of other way around, as you have the English language as a official language, but then you offer students the possibility. Where did this idea originally came from? Do you know?
Yeah, sure. So the founder, whose name is Dorothy Goodman, she had this vision that that there should be a school in Washington D.C., a major world capital. She had this vision that the school should promote language learning and that it should promote an understanding of cultures around the world. And she had a strong history background, so she was really interested in making sure we had a world history and world geography program, which we still have. So she started the school as a bilingual school. And so those kids, the first kids who came into the school in 1966 were being immersed in French and Spanish. And so we've kept that model and have just developed it or improved on it, I think, over the years. So even though we accept students later in their schooling career, so for example, a student might come in at age 13 or 15 without fluency in one of the three main languages of the school, we will still work toward getting them as fluent as possible. But we do have that opening for kids to come in who might not be quite fluent. But I would say every year between 60 and 70% of our students graduate with that full IB bilingual diploma, which means they've attained a very, very high level of fluency in at least two languages. We also have a number of students who keep their language skills up in their native language, which might be Finnish, or it might be Swedish, or it might be Arabic, but they've come to the school and their families will contract with a tutor to keep their language skills high, and we give them the space and the training to be able to do that. So a lot of our students are getting that bilingual diploma outside of French and Spanish, but with another language, which would be mainly their native language.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. One of the weirdest things, like we have a Finland International School in Maldives, and most of the people who I know, they ask, what is there many Finnish people living in Maldives? Right. What is this idea? So in a way, I feel that even though we don't at the moment offer different languages as a learning language, what we offer is the international school atmosphere about the culture and different ways. So we have our curriculum comes from the Finnish core basic curriculum. It has been adjusted that fits the Maldivian laws, the country, and the society.
Right, and my experience working in international schools and working with international schools around the world is that each one has its own special identity, and so there's not one international school model, and I find that just fascinating to see how different schools adapt to the culture they're in, and I think it's really important that a school think about its surrounding culture and what the local culture can do to raise up the level of exploration and cultural understanding that can happen in a school.
Yeah, exactly. There's no one model that you could copy paste and switch it to another country, or even inside a country. Well, obviously US is so big, but if we are talking about smaller countries, something could work in the capital, but then you cannot just copy and paste it into another place. So you need to take to consideration the local situation and the society and community as well. What about, you mentioned international schools around the world, and if I remember correctly, you have some history with working with other international schools as well, not just in Washington.
Yes. So I spent 10 years living in Belgium and Brussels, and so I worked for two different schools there. I worked for the British School of Brussels and had a much longer tenure with the International School of Brussels. I was there for 9 years and 1 year at the British School. But then in my work there, I was a full-time high school teacher in those days. But in my work there, I got involved with a number of different organizations and ways of teaching and so forth that exposed me to a number of other international schools. So in the meantime, I would say over the last 20 years, I've done a lot of consulting with schools. So I've been around the world working with international schools, just helping teachers think about how they can teach more deeply and really foster stronger thinking with their students.
Yeah, that leads us to the main point why I wanted you to be on the podcast, that we share some interest. You have 20 years of history and experience on the topic, but I just have a couple of years history with promoting students thinking, and you have actually worked with many of the people and in the Project Zero from Harvard, and you have first-hand experience how to run a Project Zero programs. How did you in the first place? How did you find out Project Zero?
Sure. So this was back in Brussels in the late 1990s. I was a full-time high school English teacher and teaching in the IB diploma program. So I was teaching advanced literature, but also general classes in literature as well. And my school got involved with a consortium of international schools in Northern Europe who were really interested in taking on Project Zero's Teaching for Understanding framework. And it had just been developed. It was developed in the mid-90s. And so my head of school and the head of school of about 5 or 6 other international schools got together and formed this consortium. and worked with Project Zero to develop a model for supporting teachers in these schools on a regular basis. So what happened was that Project Zero developed a summer institute that lasted about 7 days over the course of the summer. And each of the schools would send a group of, say, 5 to 7 teachers to learn with the Project Zero researchers about the framework. And then the promise was that these teachers would take it back to their classrooms, adapt it to their own practice, and those researchers would come over 2 or 3 times a year and support us in various ways. They would lead workshops, they would meet with us individually, and then we would have a spring conference in one of the European international schools where we would each present, the teachers who had been involved would present and show what they were doing over the course of the year. So it was this really great iterative process of being introduced to an idea, understanding the theory behind it, then putting it into practice, and then sharing out with our colleagues what we were doing. So I got involved with that project, and I think I went to the Summer Institute in 1999, although my school had been involved for a couple of years at that point. So I was being exposed to these ideas in my school, but I actually went to the Institute in 99 and then started presenting at Project Zero spring conferences and so forth right after that. And then in 2001, I was awarded a sabbatical year leave from my school, and I was taken on by Project Zero to be a visiting scholar. So I was able to spend a whole year there, immersing myself in Project Zero ideas, doing some writing, doing some research, but also picking up some consulting that the researchers would give me to work with teachers in various schools. So I would say 2001 is when I really became fully immersed in it, and then started on this sort of path toward helping other teachers learn how to use these tools.
Yeah, that's very interesting. If we may take one step back, because for us, Project Zero is quite clear, but there might be some listeners who are not that familiar with the whole idea. Project Zero is, I think, over 50 years.
Yeah, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. I think they're in their 52nd year. They were founded in 67, so they're in their 53rd year now. So they celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2017, and it was founded by a philosopher of the arts who was a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education named Nelson Goodman, and he was really interested in understanding how artists make sense of their world and what cognitive processes that they're going through. He understood that artists see the world through, say, a different lens than the average person, and he really wanted to study that. So he pulled together some fellow professors and some graduate students, and they started looking at the research on this very question, and they found that there was a lot of research and a lot written on it, but it wasn't very solid. It didn't give the evidence that they needed to understand those cognitive processes. So they said, we're starting at zero. So that's where they got the name. We're calling this Project Zero. I think the original conception was that it would last maybe 2 or 3 years. They would do this research. They would create this body of work. They would publish it, and then they'd go on to other interests. But here we are 53 years later, and 2 of the graduate students of Nelson Goodman have kept the project going, and their names are Howard Gardner and David Perkins. And they've been prolific writers and speakers on a number of different issues related to cognitive science, and have just done a great job keeping Project Zero alive and moving it into all kinds of interesting new directions. Yeah.
Actually, in this podcast, I have mentioned David Perkins' books quite many times already. Okay. I really enjoy his way of his approach and viewpoint of a holistic, like not just the cognitive side of the thinking side, but also for the better tomorrow, better future. So I really like his writing as much. Of course, I'm sure quite many listeners know Howard Gardner for his work on multiple intelligences and so on. But then that actually now takes me, 53 years ago, and then if we go back to 2017, it feels, for me, 2017 feels like a decade ago. I don't know.
Yeah.
by that time, I was invited to go to US in St. Louis to give a speech about Finnish school system and thinking skills in Finland, the Finnish framework and curriculum. And I was just a fourth grade teacher. No, I don't mean just. I don't mean to, because right now I'm teaching fourth grade, but I didn't know next to nothing. I was learning about the Project Zero work, especially the framework by Ron Richard, Cultures of Thinking and Making Thinking Visible. And then things kind of just started snowballing. And all of a sudden I was in Washington International School. My eyes open like, wow, schools and schooling and learning can be something very, very different and very something I didn't never had dreamed of, that being a teacher or being a student could be. Actually, then and there was the first time I really thought to myself, like, what if I, at some point of my career, would be able to go abroad and be a teacher there? And then fast forward 3 years. Well, of course, the world is in very, very different situation than 3 years ago. But also the one thing that we are the most interested in is students thinking and learning. And that, in my opinion, during the past 2-3 months, there has been very interesting historical changes also in how we approach teaching, how we approach learning, how we approach thinking. For you, what have been the biggest things that you have noticed now past weeks and months?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not an easy question to answer, but it makes me think almost with a chuckle that we're going to start referring to the way things were as sort of PC, pre-COVID, and then there's this post-COVID-19 period, and what's the world going to look like when we can actually be in a room with other people safely, and what will teaching and learning, how will it change? How will they change based on what we've learned? So I think the jury is out. I think we're still trying to figure many things out. There's several things that I've noticed or that I've had my attention drawn to through following different trends on social media, through talking with a lot of teachers around the country and around the world, through different work that I do, and then just my own personal work. So for us here in DC, and I think it's true around the world, I think there are issues of equity and access that have come into really stark relief for us. So for those children and families who have ready access to laptops or devices and to the internet, they've been able to keep up with learning. And again, the quality of learning varies depending on the teacher and the school and the situation, but just the basic ability to be online and to learn with others is not available for some people. And I think we have to figure that out. And certainly in this country, that's been a really, really, really huge issue, and in the city where I live. So that those questions of equity and access, I think, should guide us as we go back to school at some point and think about why is it that we've let that happen. That's something, and while that doesn't necessarily get into teaching and thinking and understanding, I think it does have a big impact, because I think David Perkins really influenced me about 7 or 8 years ago, when he talked about that a lot of the discussion in education in this country has to do with the achievement gap. And I'm sure that's true around the world, where we talk about certain groups of children who seem to do well on standardized tests and by all measures succeed in the educational system. And then there's a whole group of students in certain demographic groups who don't. And so there's this big gap that exists between them. And it's been very, very hard for us to make that gap narrow. He talked about the achievement gap is the wrong way to frame it. We should be talking about the relevance gap. And by that he means that we're pushing children, often from marginalized groups, into a kind of schooling that is more about compliance, that's more about rote memorization than we are with kids from more privileged groups. And therefore, all this talk that we're doing about thinking and understanding and learning should be available to all. But the truth is that oftentimes it's really available to the privileged few. And therefore, the question I have is, how do we make this accessible to everyone? How do we get every teacher fired up like you and I are fired up about teaching and learning and about really promoting thinking, so that every child has access to it? And I think in the COVID-19 world and in the shutdown and all that, we should be asking those hard questions and doing something about it. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I can go into more specifics what I've learned about thinking and about understanding and teaching and learning through this period as well.
Well, let me just say that that has been very visible all around the world. If I take Finland for example, some of the schools, some of the teachers and the classes, you even might say when they all of a sudden in 2 days they switched to remote learning, to online school, because the school had the ICT equipment, right. They had the platforms ready, everything was already in whatever application software they were using. So in a way, the only thing that changed was the students didn't come physically to the school. But then it also revealed in Finland, the country that is kind of thought as the golden standard in the public school point of view, that some cities, some schools, some classes, nothing happened for days or even weeks. Because I don't know, it might be about the equipment or the teacher or the families, what was the case in each of the situations. But it was very, very unbalanced, very unequal. Some of the students, I would say, they during this springtime in Finland, it didn't really affect their learning negatively or positively, just kept going. But some, it stopped completely. Right. And the same thing, if we go to even then countries that are not that wealthy, or the public school system is not that well established as it is in Finland, even the gap will be even wider. So yeah, that is especially very, very good point, and something that I have been thinking about as well.
Yeah, it makes me think about all kinds of movements and ideas in education that stem from sort of what I consider the gold standard in good teaching and learning, which would be constructivism and social constructivism, and on which Project Zero ideas are based, and on which I think many schools and school systems are based. Sometimes we moved far away from that gold standard, but the idea that we construct our own knowledge, and that we learn from one another, and that deep understanding is truly what we should be aiming for. It's not about memorizing for a test and regurgitating and then moving on to something else and forgetting about what we've learned. That kind of old-fashioned way of conceiving of education still exists, we know, and unfortunately it exists in too many places. But I think most countries in the world that have well-established public school systems have either subscribed to constructivism, whether or not they've implemented it well. Having said that, I think it's raised all kinds of questions for me about the possibility of raising the profile of some of these pedagogical methods, of ways that we go about schooling in the future, that maybe we can give those methods and ways a higher profile and make them stick in a way that we weren't able to before. And I think in this country, certainly we've lost our way with the 20 years of standardized testing. We've really crammed down teachers and students' throats. And these are to me ridiculous exams that are not really measuring much that's very important in the world in terms of children becoming global citizens and becoming good thinkers. They're really about rote memorization and filling in bubbles on a piece of paper. And we've made that the measure by which we judge a teacher for being effective, how the students do on the test, and it's the measure by which we judge schools if the students are passing the test. And we've lost our way in such a major way over the last 20 years because of federal policies, but also state policies that have encouraged that. So it makes me think that maybe there's now a grand opportunity for us to rethink schooling, to rethink teaching, to rethink the way children learn. And in particular, I'm really thinking about a number of things. One is personalized learning, so that whereas in the past, we often thought of this kind of factory model of schooling where say 20 or 30 children are in a classroom and we're teaching to the whole class, oftentimes the sage on the stage, the teacher up in the front of the room, and the children are in rows and listening and absorbing, but there's oftentimes not much that's happening in terms of their own active engagement with ideas.
Yeah.
That's a very old-fashioned view of teaching, but it still exists in many parts of the world. So the idea that every child learns at a different pace, and every child has different interests, and every child has the right to be able to pursue interests and projects that are interesting to or that are fascinating to that child. So maybe there's a way to think about personalized learning procedures and methods and pedagogies that really allow for children to thrive in a way that we haven't allowed them to in the past. That's one thing that I'm really thinking about, and I think this sort of world of online learning, being forced into this online learning platform, gives us a chance to think about that. The other thing I'm thinking about is, and you and I have been involved in this project called Making Thinking Visible, and we work a lot with Zoom at my school, so our classes are being held through Zoom, like you and I are speaking now through Zoom. And
yeah, same thing for us.
Yeah, and there's just so many ways that Zoom, a platform like Zoom, is helping us to make thinking visible that regular classroom teaching in like 20 kids in a class or 30 kids in a class with a teacher weren't able to do as efficiently. And by that, I mean that if we think about the documentation of learning and of thinking, it's a big task for a teacher to try to capture all that's happening with children in a classroom all the time. And so oftentimes teachers had to in a sense, figure out when that was going to be able to be possible, and then again, figure out the modalities to use, whether it was going to be recording something, whether it's going to be writing something on chart paper or whatever else. There were a lot of things that happened that could easily go wrong or could prevent the teacher from doing it. So the documentation of thinking, that process of learning, was often fraught with obstacles in a way that I think Zoom, in a sense, allows for us to do it in a way that we don't even have to guide it. So, for example, in Zoom, when we have the chat feature, it could be that a teacher could be on modeling something or sharing some information or having a conversation with students, but the students can be sharing their thinking and giving feedback or whatever's happening in the chat function, and that chat function can be saved. So the teacher can save it at the end of a lesson and then go back and review it and then let what the students are thinking, where there might be some misconceptions or there might be some superficial thinking, the teacher can go back and address those the next time he or she sees the students. And we don't get inside students' minds oftentimes when we're in the classroom in such a powerful way. And it's not that every child is writing in the chat function everything that he or she might be thinking, but a lot of times I'm seeing children are putting a lot of ideas there that they might not have shared in a regular classroom setting. You also can record the Zoom classes so that you can have that as a record and go back and listen, and maybe there are some things you missed. And I think as the single adult in a classroom, it's very easy to miss things or to be excited by one child's comments, but then completely overlook another child's comments just because you got excited about something and your mind was on that. So by being able to go back and look at a class or listen to a class or look at the chat or figure out what was going on in breakout rooms, I think we're able to make thinking visible in a more powerful and I would say more efficient way than we've been able to do. And I would hope that that's informing what happens when we go back into the classroom, that we come to understand how important making thinking visible is.
We use Zoom daily, and then we have online assignments in Google Classroom and all sort of things, different kind of assignments. But for me, if I go back, let's say maybe 2014 or so, when I first started to shift away from what you call the old story of schooling, the factory-based line, slowly in the classroom started giving up what I called control. I let loose the students' thoughts, their ideas, and their excitement, keeping everything moving forward to some direction that I wanted us to go, but letting the students find their way. It took me quite many years to really feel comfortable with letting go of the control and understanding that it's not the quantity. If a student works for the whole lesson in math with just one activity or one assignment, really struggles the whole lesson, tries to figure it out, might be much more deeper learning, much more engaged, motivating than finishing 100 assignments in a worksheet. So, but then I had to come make peace with myself to see that sometimes there's nothing much proof of results taken during the lesson. And it was a big thing. And I feel when I've been working with teachers in Finland, in my previous city and then other cities as well, this is one of the main things for what is keeping teachers, holding them back. They feel like they need to control everything. They need to make sure everyone is same page, same activity number. So keeping everything kind of in the same line. And now when we move to online situation, I found after 2 or 3 weeks of remote learning and online school, I stopped and I felt like something is off here. Like, I don't know what is going on, but I don't see the learning that I see in normal classroom. The same students that I saw in January and February and last year, there's something is now wrong here. And then I started to look at the assignments that we were handing over. And the assignments, actually, they were closed questions with correct answers, a list of tasks. I tried to use the same routines that we use, and the students are very, very familiar with them in a normal situation, and kind of disguise the closed questions for thinking routine, like using thinking routines to solve the closed questions. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. And then I realized, and my colleague, I work with 2 teachers with 50 kids. We have a quite large class. We realized that actually now when we shifted to online, we teachers, we changed our way back to the old story of giving a list of assignments and work to do. That was for me a very big wake-up call that when things changed, I went back to the old familiar, the safe, the controlled way. And one of the things that I've learned to overcome that, one of the things has been, for example, the work that you have been doing with Smithsonian museums and your colleagues online live session. Would you like to tell us a little bit of that work and how teachers have you came across a similar experience of teachers kind of rolling back the years in a wrong way?
Yeah, Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon that I've seen here too. I've seen it especially in our public school systems, whereby the central office, or whoever's in charge, is creating these like huge packets of worksheets that families are supposed to come pick up, and that's supposed to serve as the learning that's going to be happening over the next week or month or months. And if there's a chance to interact with a teacher online, or to have a class, great, but that's not a guarantee, and it's often not happening. And so therefore these worksheets, or these sort of fill in the blank kinds of activities, are what the schools have resorted to. I mean, I will say that at my school, it's certainly been a big challenge to make this transition, but we were pretty prepared for it. I mean, we had I'll go back a little bit in history. In 2010, we had a huge snowstorm here, which we called Snowmageddon, because it felt like the world was coming to an end, like Armageddon. And we had 26 inches of snow on the ground. And Washington's a city that doesn't get a lot of snow in the winter. And so the city just shut down for 6 days. And so we didn't have school for 6 days. And we were looking at having to extend the school year and trying to figure out how to make up all that time. We had students who were taking IB diploma exams, and we had to figure out how to keep the learning going. And so our IT department, along with the school leadership, decided then that we were no longer going to observe snow days. They weren't going to be days off school. Whenever we had any kind of shutdown for whatever kind of natural disaster or human-made disaster, we were going to keep the learning going as best we could. So we started initiating this plan 10 years ago, whereby our teachers would be well prepared and our students would be well prepared to do online learning. And so we've been practicing that for 10 years, and certainly this put us in a much higher level to have to attain something, because we knew it would last for weeks, if not months, and it certainly has. But we made the transition pretty well. We had a few lucky things happen, in that our spring break was happening right at the time that we had to shut down the school. So we had a few days to prepare and to kind of take a breath and relax. But the teachers have been really hard pressed. Many of them have said they're working a lot harder now than they were working during normal days, when they still considered themselves working very hard. So there are a lot of, I think, social emotional challenges that we haven't addressed in this time. Certainly we haven't addressed what happens with adults, teachers who have young children at home, and they've got to be supervised at the same time they're having to teach classes and all that. There are all kinds of challenges. What do you do with 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds who are pre-literate, who can't be on a device on their own, and they need a parent nearby or an adult nearby? All those kinds of things we haven't all worked out. We're working on solutions, but nobody has found the silver bullet. However, what I want to say about this question of sort of moving back to the traditional or moving forward with innovation. At our school, what I was so excited about, and I've said it on some classes, and I've certainly seen a lot of the stories that teachers are sharing. We've worked really, really hard over the last 12 years to become a school that has a true culture of thinking. And we use thinking routines all the time, from the youngest children to the oldest children. And those practices didn't go away when we switched to online learning. So I sat in on a Spanish humanities classroom the other day for 8th graders, and these are all advanced speakers of Spanish, and they're studying history and geography in Spanish. And they were studying about the age of exploration and the Europeans coming into the New World, into the Americas. And they did a tug of war, which is a thinking routine that was developed by Ron Richard and his team at Project Zero. And they did it using a Padlet device, and they were able to make their own electronic Post-it notes and show whether they agreed with the big question that the teacher posed about, was the age of exploration good or bad for the indigenous peoples in the Americas? And so they based on all their reading and their research that they had done, they were able to show the pull of forces. So there were some positive things that came from that, but there were some also really horrible negative things. And then there's some things that might have been somewhat neutral. And they were able to show the complexity of the response to the question, and then justify their responses in a way that I think we would have seen in a powerful way in a face-to-face setting, but it was just as powerful online. And again, that idea that the teacher has a chance to record this, to save it, to go back to it with those students or to use it as a way to inform what she's going to do next. If students were weak in their responses or they didn't respond so much, then she can go back and in a much more systematic way and address some of those things than maybe she'd been able to do before.
I've been also using Padlet quite a lot, and many of the same routines that we have been using over 1 year with the students, and I love Padlet for the reason you just mentioned, that the students can actually move the things, their thoughts, and they can work together, and everyone can see the same thing. In classroom, in normal settings, we might be sharing the thinking and post it in the end for the wall or some point, but Padlet actually in the same real time, everyone can see what happens. But my problem was that even though we use Padlet in the very beginning, I was asking wrong kind of questions for the routines. Like, let's put it another way. I was choosing the wrong routines for my goals, what I wanted. If I wanted to have them just to finish some work, then I was putting them in a very weird situation when they had to discuss something, but there was the right answer that I was looking for. I wasn't actually giving them the opportunity to discuss, and I was observing them in the breakout room, like, what happened to the discussion? These kids usually they discuss, they share ideas, they have different viewpoints. What is going on? What has happened? And then after weeks, it hit me that I was making the wrong questions.
Yeah, and I just realized I didn't answer your previous question. So this gets me back to the origin of this Easy Peasy series that we were doing with Smithsonian, but it gets at this question that you're asking about, the kinds of questions. So I've been working with the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. It's an office in the central system of the Smithsonian Institution here in DC, and it's a wonderful staff of educators who are digitizing. They're taking the digitized resources that the Smithsonian has, and right now they're up to something like 6 or 7 million resources that have been digitized, and then they're putting them on a platform that is easily searchable for educators, and it's available to anybody around the world. And Smithsonian has a lot of affiliates around the country and around the world, so it's not just the museums here in Washington D.C. or in New York, but there are a lot of affiliate museums or organizations around the world that can contribute to this. So anyway, I've been working with Smithsonian for a number of years, mainly because of the work that I've been doing around town with Project Zero, and Smithsonian took note of that. And I've been doing a lot of work with Smithsonian museum educators anyway, and they about 3 years ago adopted thinking routines as the pedagogical method that should be used with these digitized resources. So they had been working with teachers on these resources for a couple of years as they developed the Learning Lab, which is that platform for educators. And they noticed that teachers would make collection. You can make your own collection. So you can search for, let's say you want to search for dinosaurs. You can find all kinds of resources that exist in the Smithsonian holdings about dinosaurs, and you can make your own, curate your own collection. But teachers were not, first of all, sure how to use these resources. So they weren't being used in a very meaningful way, in a way that integrated them into the deep learning that should be happening. And second of all, they weren't making their own pedagogical choices visible to other teachers. So in the Smithsonian Learning Lab, you can actually, in addition to creating your own collection, you can get somebody else's collection and make it your own. If somebody has made it public, you can then add to it. You can save it as your own, and then you can add to it or take things away or whatever else. So it's this really wonderfully flexible, again, constructivist way of building collections. So they chose to use, 3 years ago, they chose to use thinking routines to help teachers understand how to use museum resources, but also how to show other teachers ways to use them in their own practice. And so they brought me in to help with a lot of professional development they were doing in various projects here and in Pittsburgh, mainly Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so I've been working with them in face-to-face professional development, but I've also done a few webinars with them. But then they came up with the idea when the school shut down to create a 30-minute webinar twice a week modeling how to use a thinking routine with different museum resources. So they brought me in early on to help co-produce this series, but then also to recruit some educators in my network who could do that modeling. So every week on Monday and Wednesday, we have a half-hour webinar that we call it Easy Peasy, Easy Project Zero, and it's really about how to use thinking routines with museum resources. So it's very straightforward, and basically we introduce everybody on the broadcast, and then the participants can be in the chat, playing student. Like we'll take them through a routine so they can feel what it's like to be a student learning this way. But then they can also comment on the moves that the teacher has made, or ask questions and that kind of thing. And so we pull their comments in or their questions in and comment on them. So I facilitate these sessions with a couple of my colleagues at Smithsonian, and every week we have a guest who's modeling them. So, for example, just this week we had a middle school teacher from a local public school who teaches Spanish language arts. And she's also doing a lot of professional development in her school on culturally responsive teaching. So really trying to make sure that you build curriculum and lessons around the that are sensitive to and acknowledge the cultures that your students bring into the classroom. And so she modeled how she would use a particular thinking routine that's called Unveiling Stories. It's a global thinking routine, how she uses that to promote global competence, but she used it with two very, very different kinds of objects. One was a photograph and one was a painting. And so we've been doing that kind of work now. And what I would say about getting at that question you have about the kinds of questions, what I hope we're doing is modeling not only the open-ended kind of approach we take to content just to get students engaged and excited about what they're learning, but in doing so, it informs the teacher on thinking about what next steps would I take in building. Maybe I want to build a project around this, or maybe I want to give the students a chance to propose where they want to go with it. But then we have, again, in the thinking routine, there's a series of questions that we're asking, all of which are open-ended, but they're allowing for students or learners to discover on their own with guided facilitation. And I think the role of the teacher has become even more important. I think we've proven in this world of COVID-19 that the role of the teacher is so incredibly important as facilitator, as the one who asks those right questions and models it so that the students can start asking those questions of each other. And I think that's I think the goal of any really great teacher is to sort of fade into the background and to let the students take the stage and be the ones who ask the questions, who challenge, who play devil's advocate and those kinds of things. And the teachers just making sure that the conditions exist for that to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I really enjoyed the Easy Peasy for the main reason has been that it's been a really interactive. You have more than just one person there, you and your colleagues, that you are interacting, you're taking answering the questions that comes in the chat. What I felt like past weeks and past months, there've been such a exponential rise also in webinars and materials for remote. Like if you go to Twitter, I feel like it's only everyone is promoting or advertising something, and this material is now free for 2 months or something. Right. But most of it is based on this idea that has been bugging me for years. The kind of the promise or the premise idea behind it is that learning is with this application, with this program, it makes learning fast, it makes learning easy, and it makes it like fun in a like fun and games in a kind of way. I stopped to think like, wait a second, why learning should be, why should it be fast? Why should it be easy? And why should it be like fun and games? All those three things I disagree with. But the most thing that I see now offered to teachers are giving that promise. Here is a new application for you. Here's how you teach math very easily now in remote school. Teacher, you don't have to do anything. Students can just log in. It's fun, fast. Da, 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 da. But what you are offering, and other educators as well, but easy peasy. Even though you have the easy in the name, you are talking about your definition of easy is different. It's easy for everyone to join in.
Yeah, I think the title is somewhat problematic because I do also, like you, avoid the word fun and I avoid the word easy when I try to describe teaching and learning. But it's catchy and it seems to have caught on with a lot of people. And I think you're right. I think the easy. I haven't thought about this much, but I think the easy aspect of it is about easing into these routines and about making people feel at ease within the platform. But certainly, if you look at the chat and when you look on YouTube at the archived easy peasy sessions that we've done, you can see that the conversations become really complex and people are asking really hard questions. And what I've loved is that oftentimes they're building on each other's comments just as you would want in a classroom, so that what we're doing on the screen might be stimulating and we might be having a good conversation, but you're seeing this sidebar conversation that's sort of going off in another direction, but in a really powerful direction. And people are coming from all over the world to be on these sessions. They don't know each other, but it's just making me really excited about the idea of using these online platforms to connect with teachers and not like-minded, but people who might have a different philosophy or try a different approach or have a different way of thinking about it, so that you can have these really rich conversations about what we're doing. And so it's been a real pleasure, and I've certainly grown sort of easier in my facilitation. The first few I was really nervous about it, but as we've done them, the people I'm working with are so professional and so relaxed about what they're doing. They know what to do technically, that we don't have to worry about it when we're facilitating. So it's become better. And the teachers have just been, that I've invited to be on the program, have just been terrific. And they've all been working with me for a number of years on different projects or serve on the faculty in our summer institute or something like that. So it's been really easy to recruit them to come in and do some of this work.
Yeah, I really appreciate the work you have been doing. And I've been promoting it in our school as well for our staff. I'm responsible of our PD program in our school, and we've been working towards the culture of thinking on a school-wide level. Like we had a very great start back in January, February. Things were really, the culture was growing, and I saw remarkable movement and change happening. And then the COVID situation happened, and now, for obvious reasons, it kind of we had to give it up. But now, when we have 2 weeks holiday, I can rethink, and we have at least 7 more weeks of online school coming up. And now I'm actually going to introduce a PD program for those 7 weeks. So trying to adjust the situation in the online platform. How can we make the PD program not just a PD day once a month? How can we implement it in everything we do on a daily basis? It's going to be a very interesting challenge for me and for our school. Have you, in the Washington International School, has the PD been continuing even though you switched to remote work and remote teaching?
Yeah, it has been. I think It's been a challenge, but I think, like you, the people who are in charge of the PD program. I used to be in charge of the PD program for our grade 6 through 12 teachers, but I moved into a new role about 4 years ago. So the person who replaced me is one of my close allies in the school, and she's really involved with Project Zero as well. So she's kept all that work going, and she recently just introduced with our STEAM community coordinator what they're calling it's a 2 times a week 30-minute session that's inspired by Easy Peasy, but they're calling it Zoom Jazz. So what they do is what they're trying to do is have a 30-minute session that introduces a new tool or practice that teachers could use. And so the idea is to try it on and do something, kind of crazy with it, and then think about how it can apply in your own context. And so but they're really light. They're really, they're really engaging. And so we start with some kind of movement activity. It might be we're dancing. It might be we're stretching. We're doing something, and then moving into using it. So they've done 2 weeks of these, and they're trying to do them on a regular basis. She also implemented a couple of years ago what she calls Flash PD. So it's sort of like you're talking about, just in time kind of professional development. So she'll offer all during the day at different times so that teachers' schedules can be accommodated. She'll offer a 20 or 30-minute session, which is a one-on-one about various topics. It might be about informal assessment. It might be about using a particular thinking routine. It might be about something that's to do with social emotional learning. But she offers these, and people just sign up for them, and they now they're doing it. They used to do them face to face, and now she's doing them on Zoom. And but it's really a in a sense, a differentiated way to do professional development instead of everybody in the room together trying to learn one thing. And so those have been very successful. And she's just resumed those online, and that's been fun to see. And then she's promoting the Easy Peasy within the school. So we get a number of our teachers who come on every week to interact with us. And then we're looking for other opportunities. So again, the program has continued, but we're actually looking at our school year will end in about 3 weeks time.
Yeah.
And so we'll have a summer break, and then we'll come back, we hope, in August. We're not sure whether we'll be able to come back on campus or whether we'll have to continue distance learning. But now I'm working with a task force to really think about how do we learn from the lessons of the past 2 months? How do we curate, and that idea of having like all these things available for us, like you said, some good, some bad, some in between. How do we curate the kinds of tools that are going to help us maintain our culture of thinking that we've established and help us be better teachers? How do we find those resources and get them in the hands of our teachers so that they don't have to go out searching for things on the internet and on their own? And so we're working on that so that when we come back in the fall, we'll have a very clear PD program for teachers, but also a lot of recommendations to make about how to create a community of thinkers online if we have to go to distance learning in the fall as well.
Yeah. That's very, very, very important point in my opinion, that you find from the millions and millions of resources that is available, that you find the really the good ones that are free, accessible by everyone, and then you find the value. What do you do with that resource? What adds? Because if I have a math lesson, and if the same lesson can be done with me recording a math video, if it's just me explaining fractions, what value does the interactive, the Zoom moment bring to the game? Well, some student might ask a question, I don't understand, could you explain again? Then I explain again. But if it could be just done as a video, teaching video, maybe that should be then a teaching video. What do I do with the students? What do I do with the kids? What is the extra value, the purpose of joining in the same space, same room, even though we are physically apart? So that's, for me, that's the main takeaway, the key points that I've learned. I really need to look into what is the value of me and the students coming together in Zoom or whatever application you are using.
Yeah. And I think, there are a lot of considerations now that teachers have to make, try to limit the screen time that, especially younger kids, but that all kids are on and teachers are on these devices, so that if you can be really efficient with bringing people together, checking in with them, and then providing a prompt or a provocation for what they're going to do, and then giving them a chance to do some of the exploration offline, and then a chance to come back and debrief or get feedback or whatever, however that might look. I just think that it provides, if we can be flexible with our schedules and be flexible with the way that's going to happen, it gives us a chance to rethink the daily schedule and the way school has been done for so long. We're such, at my school, and I'm sure you probably are at yours, we're such slaves to our daily schedule. So you've got 1 hour with kids about sometimes 2 days in a row, sometimes every other day. And so you're stuck in that 1 hour mindset where you've got to cram in all that content or do whatever, all the things you need to do in that 1 hour, and you might not see them again for 48 hours or 72 hours. So you got to plan and think about that. Well, in this model, where if we remain somewhat flexible and we try to limit the screen time, maybe there's a different way of thinking about learning and the way it happens, and also maybe there's self-pacing that students do. Some students are going to be learning at a different pace, and maybe that this is going to be a good thing for them because students take longer to process, or they like to slow down, or they like to linger over something, and they're not having to rush as we might have had to do in a class when we had a clock ticking away. I haven't found the answer to that, but I think it opens up all kinds of possibilities for experimentation and for exploration.
Yeah, it sure does, but it's like you mentioned, it depends very strictly on the model that we are accustomed to. Also, then the curriculum is playing a major part in this, because, for example, in our school, as we are using the Finnish core curriculum, it gives us almost total freedom to move around the content, the topics, the themes, the goals. We can we don't have anyone giving us from above, giving us, this is your next 7 weeks. These are the content. These are the topics. Go and deliver this one. Finnish, the idea of Finnish school system and the Finnish approach, or the ethos of Finnish school, is that in a situation like this, we can actually, we had these kind of plans for April and May, but these plans that we made back in February, they don't go well with online school. They don't go well with remote school. Then we can actually move those aside for the later year and bring some of the content, some of the ideas that better fits the remote learning situation. But I know here in Maldives, some other schools that are using different curriculums that are very strict, even down to their lesson plans. So it comes from somewhere else. Then the teacher doesn't really have any freedom or being flexible. So once again, we go to back where we started from, the equal, how this affects different schools, different teachers, different students, very, very different. Also from the pedagogical point of view, curriculum point of view, ICT, it's a very interesting time in history.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And I just hope that it has us all rethinking the possibilities of school. I think in general, schooling had got into a bit of a rut, and I think there were sparks of good things happening all over the world, and certainly in schools in this area. But I think the trajectory of schooling in this country had gotten into such a rut that we had to have these things happening, and we had to have these kinds of tests, and we had to have this kind of accountability. And they weren't helping children learn any more deeply, and they weren't closing that achievement gap that I referred to earlier. And so all these millions and millions and millions of dollars that have been spent on what we call accountability haven't produced any kind of positive results. So to me, it's just been a waste of money for 20 years. So maybe now with this crisis, there's a chance for us to rethink. And I don't have a lot of hope that our federal policy is going to change, but I do have a lot of hope because a lot of public education is in the hands of the states and localities in this country, that some really good thinkers at the local and state level can start rethinking school. And by necessity, some of them are going to have to. And I'm in an independent school, so we don't have the state control that a public or state school would have. So we're able to do the kind of experimenting much more easily than a state school. However, we do have the IB diploma. So again, that's an external source that is telling us you have to do so many things. But they've had to lighten up and relax a lot of their requirements as well, given the situation.
Yeah. It is a complex situation, and like we mentioned earlier, can't really copy one solution. If some school finds a very good way how to approach the remote learning, how to do the PD, that model just that you cannot copy paste it into another one. And that's one of the things that I like I mentioned, I really enjoy the easy peasy. You are actually interacting with the other teachers who are hosting it, and also with the people who watching. Like it's not something that is restricted to some school or country or idea or materials or platform or anything like that. You can find a way how to use those ideas. And speaking of ideas and new resources, have you already did you receive the power of making thinking visible? There it is.
Yeah. I just formed a an online book group. So a number of my colleagues around the city and I are going to do an online book group happy hour. So we're going to have thinking, learning, and drinking together about every other week, just to go through the book. So we have a summer institute that we're moving online. That's the first week of August. So these are all people who are on the faculty of that institute, and so we're going to meet every other week to discuss parts of the book leading up to the institute. So we'll have read it all and discussed it by the time Ron is one of our guest speakers, Ron Richard. Right. So we'll have read it and absorbed it by the time the institute comes.
Yeah. I unfortunately I cannot get any physical copies at the moment to Maldives, but I bought the Kindle version and
good.
read it, and I really enjoyed it. People, listeners, buy the book. It's very good theory, how to do it in practice. Also, I think it's very, very good for this moment. It gives you ability, a framework to rethink learning and teaching in a way. Maybe webinars, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour. It might be interesting and engaging, but when you have a book and you can read it and you can learn on your own pace, and you can. That's a major thing. Have you been able to read? Did you start already sneak peeks, or are you waiting?
Yeah, so I just got it this week, and so I started reading it, and it's great. I mean, I've been really close to Ron for many years. He was one of my mentors when I first got involved with Project Zero, and he was on that project that I mentioned with international schools. So he was one of the researchers who was coming to our school back in the 90s and working with us individually. And so I've had a long relationship with Ron, and I've read and promoted all 4 books that he's published now since 2000, and so it's really exciting to read it. I know a lot of the people who are mentioned in it, who give examples. They're all part of this worldwide network that we have of people who are involved in making thinking visible. So it's really exciting to see that. What I would say about this book that I think stands out is that I think he and Mark, who's the co-author, are really paying attention to the need to show how these ideas translate in all kinds of circumstances. And I think they've always done that, but I think they've made a special effort in this text to highlight how these routines work with children with neurodiversity, how these routines work with young children, really young children, how these routines work with children in marginalized communities. And so I think it's making a strong case for this as a pedagogical framework that that transcends demographics. And again, I think people need to see those examples, and they need to see their own children represented. And I think this book is doing that. I haven't finished it, but I think it's doing that in a way that makes me really happy, because we get those same kinds of questions when we have our summer institute, is that, oh, this looks great with the kinds of kids you're teaching, but they're middle class kids. I'm working with kids who don't have breakfast in the morning, or who aren't being supported at home for their learning. And a lot of times it's about survival. How can I build that same kind of culture of thinking? And it's not an easy there's not an easy prescription to put into place for responding to someone who has those concerns. So they've got to be able to see examples, videos, written examples. They've got to try things on. They've got to then experiment with them, and they've got to be coached. And all those things need to happen. And so I think building that kind of supportive network in a city or in a region is just so valuable or within a school, is just so valuable and almost a necessity for the success of these routines to take hold.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I really liked the aspect that both Ron and Mark they are quite clear, very clear about what they are not promising. Like they are also not just promising, oh, everything will be beautiful and ready, just follow these steps 1, 2, 3. But they are very, very clear what they are not promoting, what they are not promising to do. I really like when author can pinpoint, narrow it down, that this is what we are doing, this is what we are talking about, and this is how we back our arguments.
Yeah.
And I mentioned to Ron that it reminded me of John Dewey's Experience in Education, the book that he wrote like maybe 10 years after the first Chicago school opened and the other so-called Dewey schools opened around the US. And the feedback and the criticism Dewey received about, wow, the kids are, there's no rules, there's no curriculum. And then he kind of answered to that criticism in a very argumentative way. Like, okay, you are talking about something different. What I'm talking about is like redefining the promise, if you may use that word.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good, and I think Ron has learned a lot from his experience at Project Zero and some of the ideas that have had such prominence throughout the world. So, for example, Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences that you mentioned, which was developed in the early 80s. And it's really what put Project Zero on the map. That's what gave it worldwide fame, the MI theory that Howard developed. And he didn't really develop it as a theory of pedagogy or of teaching. He developed it as a theory of cognitive science, just to help cognitive scientists understand much more about the brain as we were getting better ways of getting brain imaging. And we were learning so much more about the brain. And he was thinking about it in those contexts. But teachers really took it on, and they saw that this could inform the way we teach and the different approaches that we take and so forth, and can invite more students into the learning in a way that maybe we haven't before. But he also saw that it was being badly misused in places, and he became really concerned about and he called it the ethical responsibility of educators or of theorists. And when you put an idea out in the world, you're responsible for it, and if it's badly used, you've got to call it out, and you've got to pay attention to that. So I think, Ron, having studied that and having seen those kinds of things happen, has been very clearly influenced by that, and therefore front loads. This is what this can do for you, but we're not promising something else. What I also love about Ron and the work that he and Mark have been doing over the last 20 years is that they've studied very carefully the way thinking routines have been taken on by teachers in powerful ways, but they've also studied the way that it's gone awry. So where teachers have just treated the learning quite superficially, or they've seen it as a one-off activity. And they don't decry that. They don't say that, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm,
what they say is it's a process of learning that the teacher needs to go through, so that if you're not satisfied with what you're getting out of your students in terms of their thinking, then maybe you need to go back to the drawing board and think about, were you clear about your goals? Were you clear about what you were asking them to do? And they give lots of examples in that way in the book as well. And I just think that's really helpful to see, so that I think every educator can find a place within it and to think about one's own practice. And I just think if it prompts us to be more reflective, then it's accomplished a huge goal.
Yeah, and that in that way, it really hit the mark for me. Like I mentioned earlier about transforming from the physical classroom to the online, and what I realized. Now I'm doing something very, very different, and something that I don't usually do. So that point of understanding, wait a second, something is going on. I'm observing something that isn't there normally, and then reflecting and going back to the drawing board. Wait a second, what are our goals? What are our expectations? What are we going to do? And then building again. Yeah. From the professional development point of view, one of the main things is to build this idea for teachers to start paying more attention of their choices. What do they? We almost everyone has the same goals. At least in a curriculum level, the goals are there. But then, what kind of materials, resources, what routines or any practices, what do we choose to get there? There's the difference, and quite often that is the problem, or the bottleneck is building around there. We are choosing the wrong things for our goals. Yeah, and you mentioned Howard Carter as well, but that reminded me of also the growth mindset by Carol Dweck. It had a similar story, that when she published the book and the idea, she's been working with that for, I think, from 80s or something, with the motivation and inner motivation. And then 2000 and something, maybe 4, 3, the book came. And like you mentioned with the Howard Gardner's ideas, it spread around, and it was implemented into school as intervention programs, not fully following what Dweck was saying. And then the results came in like, oh, hey, these interventions are not working. They're not upgrading the results, the test results. So this mindset thing is not true. And then you need to go back, and like Dweck has now done, redefined the mindset and going on a tour with I think James Nottingham from the Learning Pit. Right. They had online sessions now, like trying for the teachers to redefine what she means by the mindset and how it can be implemented in the classroom. And that's for me a remarkable thinkers, and that you can argument, you can put something publicly, and then you can take the criticism, you can hear the critique, and you can redefine, and you can make your argument even better and better. Yeah. Hey, Jim, I have a few questions that I ask from each of my guests.
Okay.
And these are, I call these quick fire round questions.
Lightning round.
Yeah, not sure if they are quick and easy, but that's the promise.
Okay.
So do you have some kind of a like your own or a quote from someone else? What is like your mantra, or something that keeps you going as an educator, something that leads the way?
Yeah, that's easy for me because there is a quotation from Vygotsky that I picked up at Project Zero, and I know Ron uses it a lot, as do many other researchers at Project Zero, and I use it in my own practice. And it's from Mind and Society, and Vygotsky wrote in Russian, but translated into English, it's children grow into the intellectual life around them, and it's just meant so much to me in the work that I'm doing here in Washington, but also the work I've been doing with Project Zero. And I just think it also charges us as educators to remember that we're models of learning, we're models of thinkers for our students, and if we aren't providing really good models for thinking and learning, then we can't expect our students to grow into that intellectual life.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful quotation, and now more than ever,
Mm-hmm.
in the current situation, how can we teachers make the environment? What aspects can we control? What can we change in the classroom? That's our playground. We know how to do that.
Right.
Now the big question is, how can we create the same atmosphere, same culture, same trust and feeling in an online setup?
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe I need to go back to Vygotsky as well to see if there is an answer to my questions. Okay, then the second easy question is that have you learned something throughout the years? Maybe something very, very important or life changing, that after the fact that you learn it, you've thought to yourself like, I wish I would have known this 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is something that I first understood, I would say superficially, but I came to understand it at university, and then I didn't apply my understanding as early in my career of teaching. So I'll explain it. So I went to a liberal arts college, 4-year college here in the university here. We call them colleges if they're just 4-year. It's a very good school and has a very good reputation. And I feel I got a really good classic education. But one thing I learned from a professor was, it's really the sort of less is more mantra, but in a different way. He said something along the lines of, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's good, or just because it's hard doesn't mean you're learning. And I came to understand, and learning was really hard for me at that university. I came from a fairly weak public school background, and I got into the university, on luck, I guess. And so I really struggled academically because it was really hard for me, because I didn't have the background that a lot of my fellow students had. And a lot of it was just seemed to be hard just for the sake of being hard, but it really wasn't getting me to learn deeply until I had a few professors who had that gift of really being able to teach for understanding. So anyway, I thought I had learned that at university, and I used to talk, by the time I was in my last year, I could really articulate that and come to understand and reflect on my 4 years there about my own learning journey. And even though it was tough for me, I really benefited from it. But then when I got into teaching, I worked in politics and journalism for a few years before I made the transition to teaching. But when I got into teaching, and I was a high school English teacher, we were reading literature, learning how to write effectively and all that. And I came to realize after a few years that I was doing a lot of assignments that were making students spend a lot of time doing things that might not have been helping them to learn deeply. I didn't intend for that to happen, but in looking back on it, especially when I came to in contact with Teaching for Understanding and the framework, I came to realize that a lot of what I was doing was to make it hard, but not to make it a really strong learning experience. And so I had to really reassess my own teaching and what I really valued. And I had to come to understand that less is more, that it's much more important to go deeply than it is to go broadly. It's much more important to have impactful assignments and conversations than it is to have students turn in 20 pages of notes. And I wish I had, for the benefit of my students, I wish I had understood that lesson much sooner, because I think I went through about 3 or 4 years of teaching when I was making these like outrageous assignments, and my best students rose to the occasion, and they did really great work. But I think I was really punishing other students who might not have had the capacity or the desire to do that hard work, and I'm not sure they needed to do that hard work. And so that's, I would say that was a lesson. And I will say I applied it when I came to teach at Washington International School. My second year there, I started teaching an 11th grade IB diploma literature course, and I taught it for 2 years. I had the same students for 2 years, and I applied it in that context. And I'd applied it before that, but I had a chance to, I'd been teaching for about 20 years at that point. I had a chance to really do a lot of reflecting and refine my teaching, and it really paid off. I think my students understood that they were learning in a different way with me, and most of them responded in a really powerful way, and they did really, really well when they were examined at the end. And the exams really do assess for understanding. And but more than that, I just felt that they had a profound learning experience in those 2 years in that class, because I had given up this idea that I had to make it really, really hard for them.
Yeah, that's so interesting point. And I think we discussed this 3 years ago as well, but my shift in teaching and my idea of teaching also happened through literature thinking, when I started introducing book clubs in my classes, instead of everyone reading one book in a schedule that I've set with the questions I've set. Let's go control, instead of letting them find a book that they are interested in and making these book clubs inside the class, and just taking a step back, listening, guiding, helping, getting the feedback and idea. And the change in the students was remarkable. Like those students who were not interested in reading at all, who really struggled in reading, like they blossomed. And when they then went to the higher grades, I remember they were in 9th grade, 15-year-olds. Some of the boys who didn't do that well in school, they were asking then my ex-colleague who was teaching them in the 9th grade for Finnish language, said, could we read more? Could we read more poetry? That we used to read a lot when we were in Finnish class. Could we read more? So it was very heartwarming to see those big 50-year-old guys who didn't really enjoy school, but they wanted to read more at school. So it left a mark on them. All right, then I have a third question. And this one is a routine that you are quite familiar with. It's called I used to think and now I think. So let me give you a time frame for this. So let's frame it before COVID-19 and before we switched to remote school. How has your thinking changed during the past 2 months?
I used to think that a complete move to online learning would rob children of valuable and holistic and coherent opportunity to learn. And now I realize that it's all about the conditions that we create. And if we have to do it online, we can do that. It might be more challenging. It might be more exhausting. It might not be the same as what we were able to do face to face, but I do see that we can do it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There are different factors that we need to consider. But with this experience, I'm sure and I really hope, at least I hope, that we can pinpoint those new factors that we need to consider. But I totally agree with you. It is possible, and it might be a little different. It might be version 2.0 or something, but it is possible. Yeah. Okay. Then the last and the easiest question. What is the difference between learning and understanding?
I think it's about nuance, and I think they can be interchangeable in a generic way, but I do think that we need to make distinctions if we're really going to talk about what we value most in education. So learning is, I would say, is a process, and learning is can be on a scale, and learning is a generic term for generally what we're trying to do in school. And we can talk about learning deeply, or we can talk about learning superficially, and then everything in between. But I think if we say I'm going to learn something, then I think we're getting at beyond just memorizing, and we're getting at what I think about with understanding. But I think in using the term understanding, we're becoming much more specific about being able to use what we've learned in new contexts. So it's about the application. It's about being flexible with learning and so forth. And when we start messing about with what we've learned, with the learning, then we're getting into the realm of understanding. So I would put understand. I don't want to talk about a hierarchy, but I would talk about understanding being what the goal of learning should be.
Yeah, makes sense, and I have quite similar definition in my head as well. And you mentioned you won't put them in hierarchy, but it's so tempting to, like, we all know Bloom's taxonomy, and we understand the reason why it was made, what was the aim for that during the scientific battle between the human sciences and then the hardcore sciences. But in a way, like, I can't get my head. I understanding being the second lowest skill of thinking.
Right. I even before I was introduced to teaching for understanding in my graduate school program for teacher preparation, we were introduced to Bloom's taxonomy. When I saw that, I already reacted badly to it, and I've never gotten over that. So I've completely rejected that taxonomy as being outdated. And yes, you're right. It was a creature of its own time and context, but it's not useful today.
Yeah,
with all that we know about
but
learning.
still it is quite influential around the world in different curriculums and textbooks, and you can see which this page and this chapter is hitting this level of thinking. And I have learned to try to look at different ways, and for that, the understanding map that comes from culture of thinking is very, very good visual way to think of understanding.
Yep, no, I agree.
Okay, is there anything on your mind that you wanna leave with?
Yeah, can I leave with this little story I heard from one of our fourth grade teachers? She's a Spanish teacher. So our students in primary school, they spend one day in English and then one day in their target language, either French or Spanish. So she's a Spanish homeroom teacher in fourth grade. So she sees her students every other day. And she was part of a project that we just finished this year called Making Across the Curriculum. And it's really encouraging making and design thinking in any kind of context, any grade level, at any subject area, and you don't need a fab lab or a maker space or anything to be able to do making. And so she's been really, really excited about it. And she's got a Reggio Emilia background and really believes in letting children's passions take them. And so she's been a little bit frustrated in our school when she's had to adhere to a more prescriptive curriculum at times. And so she got involved in this project and got very excited about it. And the other day she was reflecting on something that happened in a class when they were before we had the shutdown. And she said her fourth graders got so involved in a making project. And she realized she had assigned a certain amount of time, and she'd run out of time with them, and they were supposed to be moving on to another lesson. And so she interrupted them and said, oh, sorry, kids, we're out of time. We need to move back to go do our math lesson or whatever it was. And the students begged her to keep going because they were so immersed, and they had lost track of time. She had lost track of time. And for her, she said, that's the sign of not only high engagement, but also deep learning. And when children are so interested in the learning that they never want to stop. And certainly we have to monitor kids who might perseverate over something that's not very worthwhile and all that. And that's our role as teachers, to be the facilitators. And sometimes we do need to move on. And sometimes we need to say, we can hold on to that and come back to it. But she wants those moments more and more. And so she wants that to be what happens in her classroom on a daily basis. And it made me so excited to know that this making project got her to see that and to articulate that. But that I was always also so excited that she had that experience to be able to share with other teachers.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And actually, what was called the program?
It's a Making Across the Curriculum.
Making Across the Curriculum, and it's based on this idea that not just thinking and talking, but actually making thinking happen, making it visible in a different way.
Exactly. So it comes from research that's been going on for about 7 or 8 years at Project Zero called Agency by Design. And they posit, and they've now got evidence to show it, that children become not only more engaged and they learn deeply, but they also develop agency to act in positive ways on their world through making. And so what we've been trying to do in DC is work with a wide variety of teachers and public schools and private schools and Catholic schools to get them to understand and to weave into their own practice these practices of maker-centered learning, and then to study what's happening with their students and to see if what happened at the original project in Oakland, California, can also happen here in DC, and we're seeing that it is happening. And now that project has sort of satellite offices or satellite projects going on in Pittsburgh and in Hong Kong and in a few other places around the world. But our project has been really, really successful here, and we're just finished our third year. We're heading into our fourth year next year.
Yeah, there's a very good book also published from Project Zero.
Right.
How it was 3 years ago?
3 years ago, exactly. Maker-centered learning, right?
Yeah. Very also like easy read. You have good balance between the theory and then the practice and then ideas how to implement it in the classroom.
Right. And our feeling is we've come a long way since then, and so we're trying to work on a sequel to it.
Good. All right. That was very, very insightful and very nice to talk with you, real face to face, not in the same room. But I really appreciate your insight and your great knowledge and experience on these matters.
No, it's been a great conversation, and it's really wonderful. I know we've stayed in touch through email and through Twitter, but it's great to connect with you this way and to have this conversation. It takes me back 3 years to when we had that wonderful conversation, not only in my office at school, but over dinner. And it was a great meal and great conversation. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you for coming, and like I mentioned earlier, thank you for them inviting me to the World of International Schools. Yeah. 3 years later, here I am.
Here you are.
So it was a big game changer for my life and my career.
Good.
So, okay, Jim. Right. Thank you so much. I wish all the best for you. You have a couple of more weeks left of the school year, and I don't know. Let's hope everything goes to the better in the upcoming months.
Thank you. Same to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.